Welcome to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Romans Education Part 1, and this is session 25. Now, in working our way through the book of through Romans 12, we have come to the part that is the godly labor aspect, and that's going to be found in verses 6 through 8. And so let's read that. Having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us, rather prophecy, let us prophesy according to the proportion of faith, or ministry, let us wait on our ministering, or he that teacheth on teaching, or he that exhorteth on exhortation, he that giveth, let him do it with simplicity, he that ruleth with diligence, he that showeth mercy with cheerfulness. Now, I began explaining to you last time these things that I put back up on the board, that there were various operations, that those gifts, you'll notice then, having then gifts differing, that those various operations that God was accomplishing by use of the spiritual gifts. Now, those gifts, let me do the timeline here if I can. Maybe I ought to do that in a different color. Maybe I oughtn't. I'm not sure if this will work like I want it to. At the beginning of the dispensation of grace, look, this is, it's hard to do it on that timeline. Let's, from here, okay, up above, the yellow, see Acts 1 through 8? All right, we know that that is still God's working with Israel. He is still with them. And then, at the end of that, here's where you have, yes sir, that worked perfectly. Let me try one more and we'll see how that does. Okay, here's where Paul gets saved, right here. And we know that's the start of the dispensation of grace. There is, at the beginning of this dispensation of grace, the start of the diminishing of Israel and the rise of the Gentiles. That's the issue, that's really the issue that's talked about in the book of Acts from the time Paul comes on the scene until you get to Acts 28. By the time you get to Acts 28, Israel is totally diminished. Paul's to the Jew first ministry is over. And so now you're in, of course this is not proportionate, but now you're in the dispensation of grace. But in that beginning time, you had God giving Gentile churches spiritual gifts, supernatural spiritual gifts. But He gave them with a purpose in mind. The Bible calls those the operations. In other words, here the operation is up above the line here. There were some things that God was doing, and there were certain spiritual gifts that He was utilizing to get those things done. Now, those gifts that we see listed are not in play the way they were back then. Back then, the Spirit, we're going to read this in just a moment, but the Spirit would give every member of the assembly some supernatural spiritual gift. Now in a moment we're going to go through the gifts and kind of take a look at those. But the Spirit would give those. He's the one that decided who got what, and then you would function out of that gift. But you didn't have to prepare for that, and you didn't have to know anything. It was just supernaturally given to you. That's the way that operated at the beginning of the dispensation of grace. Now, so there's two things I want to have in our mind right here as we get ready to follow this in 1 Corinthians 12, and that is, we have to understand that there were spiritual gifts in operation back there that were supernaturally given by the Spirit. And why do we need to know about those? The reason we need to know about those is because when Paul writes this to Rome, as a matter of fact, do you remember when I told you in the book of Acts, and I showed you the verses that went along with this, that 3 times Paul makes this warning declaration to the Jews. Remember, he always went to the Jew first, then to the synagogue. He made those 3 warning declarations. He said, "Lo, I go to the Gentiles." And he said that 3 times in the book of Acts. You realize that the 3 times that Paul says that, he is in the 3 major areas where the Jews congregated themselves geographically. Rome, the last one, over there at the end of the book of Acts. Paul, remember, as a prisoner, he's gone to Rome. That's the last time he makes that statement. Rome is one of those 3 major population areas. Well, I'm just saying it that way to say that as God is moving that program along, He's making sure that that message is getting out. And one of the means of getting that message out was to give these gifts to Gentile churches. So here's what we have to understand. Why did God give those gifts to the Gentile churches? The answer is found in the operations. Those are the purposes God was accomplishing by these gifts. For those gifts to operate outside of those purposes was an abuse and a misuse of the gift. And even though some in Corinth, by the way, was a second area where they had really congregated. And so these gifts are in operation in the Gentile church of Corinth, which sat right next door to the synagogue. So there's some things that are being done. Now the Corinthians, even though some of them had a legitimate gift that was operating, some of them were faking a gift because they didn't want the one they got, they wanted a different one. And then there were some who were actually trying to participate in Satan's counterfeit. But the genuine gifts were there too. Do you see how confusing this was going to be? You really had 4 different, and maybe we'll talk about it, it's not really relevant, but you had 4 different things going on there, and you didn't know, because a guy came in to the assembly who supposedly had the gift of speaking in other tongues, and what he was actually doing is he was saying that he was denying Jesus Christ. That's what he was doing. And he was beginning to have an effect on people because they thought that was a supernatural gift. So he had a lot of confusion. No wonder the Corinthians were so messed up in their doctrine and divided up and all that kind of business. They certainly weren't operating like a body. Well, all right, having said all of that, just understand that by understanding the gifts, Paul is telling us this to Rome. By the way, Rome is another place where that was happening. The gifts were certainly in operation in Rome. And when those gifts were given, by the way, when Paul writes the letter to the Romans, the gifts are in play. That's a time when they're doing it. Those gifts only lasted for a limited period of time, and they ended, the supernatural gifts ended in the Apostle Paul's lifetime. That's what he's going to show us. In fact, that's what he's writing to the Corinthians. And with the ending of those supernatural gifts in his lifetime, we left off on this verse last time. Paul said, and because of that, I'm going to show unto you a more excellent way. And the more excellent way is a more excellent way of getting God's operations accomplished. In other words, God said, I've got a better way for you to do that. Now, in the old days, when you had bicycles, if Milton Barber were coming in to church on a bicycle, and then the car came along, you know what someone would say? I have a more excellent way for you to get in here. because it would be far better than the bicycle. And you can make all the arguments you want. Yeah, but when I ride the bike, I get plenty of fresh air. Well, I would say if you're in the car, roll the windows down. But for the purpose, so what would be the purpose of the bike or the car? To get you in here. And so, anyway, my point is, just with that, by understanding what was happening with the gifts, that's why he's writing it here. By understanding what was happening with the gifts, that is going to dovetail into the offices that we're going to occupy in this time. Because God, the Spirit, did not supernaturally put all the gifts that we're going to look at. He didn't do that with everybody here. And don't confuse your natural abilities with the supernatural gift. Because if He had given me the supernatural gift of teaching, I wouldn't be studying during the week. I'd just be showing up, and then my gift would go into operation, and I'd just be saying whatever it was I had to say. And believe me, I don't have that gift, as you can tell. Okay, so those offices, and by the way, there's a difference here, and I want to emphasize it. When the gift was in operation, and I should go ahead and make a distinction here. When the gift was in operation, the Spirit dispensed that. We're going to read this. The Spirit dispensed those gifts as He saw fit. You didn't have anything to do with it. But when we talk about what's happening today in the offices, a big difference here is that, and isn't this going to be in perfect accordance with the liberty that we have as sons? We get to choose the office that we want to function in. Doesn't that match sonship? The liberty in decision making? And that's why sometimes it's a little confusing when you're reading over the Corinthians and he says that God has given the Spirit's given those gifts severally as He will. Then people have the idea, well, God must have given me the gift. God didn't, in this time, God's not giving you the gift. He's letting you choose the office. And remember, that word office gets used in Romans 12. Remember, all members have not the same office. And so, by saying, okay, the gifts are what's in operation, so I'm writing about the gifts, but those of you that are going to come after should understand that there's a similar enough a type issue that you'll take some things that are going on with the gifts and they'll move right into the offices with some differences. One of those differences being God's not going to assign your office. You're going to get to choose your office. God's not going to supernaturally empower you to function in that office. What is He going to do? He's not going to supernaturally empower you to do your office. He's going to what you to do your office? Yeah! He's going to educate you. He's going to teach you how to function in that office. And that's part of what we've been learning. Is this making sense so far? Okay. So having gotten that, now let me take you over. And by the way, I do want to say one other thing here, and that is, it's not up to us to decide what the offices are. God has already determined that. Just like He's the one that created our physical body. And He determined what members a physical body needed. Very wisely. Eyes, ears, nose, hands, feet. You know, everything we need is there. In the same way, when He is looking at either a local assembly or the entire body of Christ, He knows what members He needs there. And that means He's the one that decides, here's the offices that I need filled. That makes sense? So He's the designer behind that. And in fact, remember what we saw in 1 Corinthians 12? But now God hath God set the members every one of them in the body, here's talking about the physical body, as it hath pleased him. God's the one that designed the physical body and said, here's what all you're going to need. And so when he comes to the local assembly, he also knows everything that we're going to need in those offices, and he has set those forth. Okay, now, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 17, but the manifestation of the Spirit is given to every man to profit withal. For to one is given by the Spirit the word of wisdom, to another the word of knowledge by the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another the gifts of healing by the same Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discerning of spirits, to another diverse kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. But all of these worketh that one and the selfsame Spirit, dividing to every man severally as He will. He's the one that made the decision about that, yes? Okay. So, seeing that, that's how the gifts went. And that's the reason he writes that. But when it's going to come to the offices, you'll see, you'll have input into that. By the way, why, just think with me for a second, why is God the one that said, okay, I need the Spirit to decide what gifts and who's getting them? You divide them up. They don't have anything to do with it. You divide it up. Why would he do that? Why would he not do it for them, but he's going to let us choose?
Because it's the Son and the child.
Okay.
Like being under grace and under the law.
Okay. That's really close. Your thinking is in the right direction. What is it? You know that we have liberty as sons, right? Okay, you understand that. Even though, now if they're saved in the dispensation of grace, are they sons? They are. They got justified, sanctified. They're given they're not educated, that's what you were thinking. They're not educated as sons yet, and now let's take Barbara's reservation, because that's the issue we want to look at. Why weren't they educated yet?
They didn't have the knowledge.
Why didn't they have the knowledge? Whoa! Where would they have gotten it? There was no completed revelation of Scripture yet. When Paul writes to the Romans, they've already got these supernatural gifts going, right? And so all they know, well, this is going to sound crazy, all they know is what they know. Okay, duh. But they can't, but do they know it all? Let me ask you this. Now be careful. Even with the gifts, do they know it all? No, they don't. Because you know what he's going to say those gifts are? He's going to say those gifts are, they're in part. They're partial. He says, we know in part, we prophesy in part. So they only had partial knowledge. But what they had was supernaturally given. But you see, they couldn't choose themselves. Now let me take all of those answers you gave, because they didn't have, I'll make this simple, they didn't have a Bible. And because they didn't have a Bible, there was no way for them to get this information on their own. And so God had to supernaturally give it to them. So the Spirit has to decide what to give and who to give it to, because the only one that knows what the operations are is the Spirit. If you don't know what God's trying to do, you don't know what to do it. Does that make sense even? A lot of do's in there. Do you understand what I'm saying though? They didn't have enough. Now, you and I have an advantage. We have a completed revelation of Scripture, and guess what? Every single one of God's operations are listed in written form in His Word. And because we're able to look at those operations and know what He wants done, you now, as a son, have the liberty to say, because I know what God is trying to do here, and I know what all the offices are, I can choose how I want to function. Does that make sense? Is there any question about that part? Okay. All right, moving on. So, looking again at this passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, there are gifts, there are 8 gifts that are listed here. And what we're going to do is we're going to continue to do this. I'm going to show you the operation. In those 8 gifts, folks, there are at least 5 operations. I'm not trying to turn this into a detailed study, so we are going to do this with enough for you to understand it, but I'm not going to tell you everything there is to know about it. And so what we did is we looked at this. So let me here give you this. Look at this first one here. He says, "For to one is given by the Spirit the word of wisdom." Now, what is the word of wisdom? What was that supernatural gift? The word of wisdom was given to someone. Now, if you're the one, let's say that Nancy was living back at the beginning of the dispensation of grace, and the Spirit gave her the supernatural gift of a word of wisdom. Now, what is wisdom? Wisdom is the ability to apply knowledge to a given situation to determine the appropriate behavior. In other words, she'd be able to take what she knows and apply it to some kind of circumstance. So if something came up with the church, and the church needed to make a decision about something, the person with the word of wisdom could stand up and say, here is the wise thing to do. You can see how that would be beneficial. And so when it came to those kinds of decisions, the assembly would look for the person with that gift. The next one is the word of knowledge. Now this is very closely connected. The word of knowledge, now what's the difference between wisdom and knowledge? The Bible does differentiate between those. When you think about the word of knowledge, think about perception and think about the ability to see below the surface, to things that are not apparent. It's really a shade different than just making a wise decision. It's being able to discern what's going on behind the scenes that's not readily visible, to keep from making what looks like a good decision but is really a bad decision. Maybe someone looks like they're doing the assembly a favor, but really what they're doing is they're manipulating something for their financial gain. And so this word of knowledge would have the ability to perceive. See, and kind of, you could say, see behind the scenes, read between the lines, all of those kinds of issues. Okay, the next one, to another, faith by the same Spirit. Now, faith is exactly what you think it is. That is the absolute confidence in what God has said and that those operations are going to do what He said they would do. That's exactly what that is. The next one is gifts of healing. Now, I want you to notice that's in the plural, gifts. It did not say the gift of healing, but the gifts plural. And this is the only one of all of the gifts that is always mentioned in the plural. Let me just show you a couple of other references real quickly. Down in the same chapter in verse 28, gifts plural of healings. Again in verse 30, gifts of healing. It's always in the plural. And there's a reason it's in the plural and not the singular. Does anybody know right offhand why it's in the plural?
Because there's different types of healings.
Oh, well, that's good. There's different types of healings. I would agree that there are, but there's a refinement to that. That's a good answer, though. Okay, made everybody else skittish, didn't it? Okay. The next one is working of miracles. By the way, we will talk about why it's gifts. I'm just not there yet. I just want to know if you had something in your mind. Okay. To another, the working of miracles. Now, you know what a miracle was. A miracle is that which supersedes the natural. Okay? And so there was that one. And then there was to another prophecy. And someone that had that gift of prophecy would receive a direct revelation from the Lord, and they would receive information that without that, they wouldn't know anything about. So the Lord would tell them things about that. The next one is discerning of spirits. And this is a good one because this was the supernatural ability to detect and recognize the working of the satanic policy of evil, to be able to recognize those seducing spirits that brought corruptive doctrine into an assembly. It was able to point out those enticing words that were always used to try to get a church to get back into Israel's program and operate out of the dispensation of grace. It could identify the doctrines of devils. All of those things along that, that's what that discerning of spirits would do. The next one is diverse kinds of tongues. And what that was the supernatural ability to speak in a language that the speaker did not previously know and had never studied. Then the last one in the list is the interpretation of tongues. By the way, if I back up to this diverse kinds of tongues, do you remember on the day of Pentecost when those men spoke in tongues? Do you remember what all those folks that had come in for the feast day had said? How hear we every man in the language wherein we were born? All right, and so the interpretation of tongues was someone else in the assembly. When there was a mixed group, and by a mixed group I mean, let's say that that someone with the gift of tongues runs into someone from Germany, and he is presenting the good news to them in German. Well, if we're with him, we have no idea what's being said. Have you ever, if you've ever watched one of those Netflix movies, they don't always tell you when it's an Oriental film, they don't always tell you if it's subtitled or if it's in English. And you start to watch one of those, and suddenly they're going, and they're just, they're just talking like that. And I have absolutely, you know I was bilingual, did you? And I have absolutely no idea what they're saying. If we were in that kind of a deal, there would be someone then with the supernatural gift to interpret that. And even though they did not know the language, they could interpret that back into the language of those that were hearing that did not know that language. So, okay, now that's that list. And the Corinthians had to recognize that all those gifts were given supernaturally with a plan in mind. That those were all given with a purpose in mind. And those gifts, okay, now listen to this carefully. Those gifts didn't just come out of the blue. They had direction behind them. And those gifts were never, ever, ever meant to operate in and of themselves and let that be that. In other words, those gifts were always operating to accomplish a specific operation for which that gift was designed. I remember when I was riding on the airplane out here back years ago, flying out here every week, flying on American Airlines every week, I saw, they'll come through about mid-flight, and they got the little cart, and sometimes I'd be the only one on the plane flying out here. And so they wouldn't bring the cart out, they'd just say, do you want something to drink? usually I'd drink, you know, a Dr. Pepper or something, you know. And I kept noticing that, and then on the flight back, they do the same thing. On the flight back was always packed. In fact, it was always overbooked. Oh, no. Okay. Anyway, the stewardess had this ring on. And this ring, if you were looking at it, you know, here's this ring, and it had a piece on it, and it went like this. There was you would, you know, put her finger through it this way, and then up off of that, it rose up, and there was a little piece of, and what she would do, huh? Like a hook. And she would take that, and those cans, instead of putting your fingernail underneath those cans, she would take that little hook and just roll her hand back, and it would pop the can open. And it would pull that lip back, and then she could just take her finger and pull it on back. And I looked at that, and I said, "Where did you get that?" She said, "One of the stewardesses designed this and had it made, and now they you know, they're in the, you know, I don't know, the stewardess gift shop. I don't know what, you know, but she said a lot of the stewardesses have them." And you know what that was? That thing was specifically made for that purpose. Now, could you use that for an engagement ring? I mean, it'll go on her finger. But is that really what it's designed for? No. It's designed for something. So when that gets used, if she's not going to be opening cans, I mean, can you imagine they're on their way to church and her husband says, "Hey, don't forget your can opening ring." Well, I'm not flying, okay? So I probably don't need it. What I'm trying to get at is all of these gifts have an operation in mind, and that's the purpose for their use. The Corinthians didn't always do that. That's why they abused those gifts. They didn't use them according to their purpose. All right, our clock ran out, so I'm going to stop here. We'll take our break, and when we come back, gosh, we're just